Good morning. We're going to be starting in about a minute. Good morning. I'm Jennifer Gross, CEO of American Friends of Tel Aviv University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, The Real Pandemic Behind COVID-19, What is Happening to Our Brain and How It Will Affect Our Future. As we enter our 7th month of social distancing and working remotely, we thought now would be a good time to learn more about what is happening inside our bodies and brains during the pandemic. And who better to discuss this topic with than our featured guest, Professor Yaniv Assaf, one of Tel Aviv University's leading researchers on the brain. Professor Assaf is the founder of Israel's first Brain Bank, a practice which scans the brains of healthy individuals and provides detailed analysis on the brain. He will discuss topics including what COVID has done to our brains, how stress affects our brains, and the social and emotional implications of the current pandemic. Professor Assaf is a 3-time alumnus of Tel Aviv University, having earned his BS, MS, and PhD at Tau. Currently, he is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology at the Segal School of Neuroscience and the head of the Strauss Center for Neuroimaging. Professor Assaf's lab focuses on MRI imaging in humans and rodents to explore the brain and how it changes from each experience, including brain macroanatomy, microstructure, and plasticity. Professor Assaf has been published in numerous scientific journals, is an invited speaker at international meetings, and holds 4 US patents for his work. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Yaniv Assaf. Professor Assaf, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I'm muted. So thank you very much, Jennifer. I just shared the screen, and thank you for everybody who registered for this webinar. And I hope we will have a stimulating hour together. So the title that I gave to this talk is What is the Real Pandemic Behind COVID-19? Because there are things that happen surrounding this pandemic that might be here much longer after COVID-19 will be gone. And this is what I'm going to speak about. But before we'll dive into what we did in the last few months in research, I wanted to ask you a question. Can you imagine what if COVID-19 would have happened in the 1980s? What would have happened? How we have went through this period if it was 40 years ago. Of course, 40 years ago, we had a different leadership, we had different technology around us, we had much less air travel. So let's think about it, and we will return to this question later on. But let's see what we have found in the research that we have done in the last few months here in Tel Aviv. So this is a graph showing you the first wave of COVID positive, number of positive people in Israel in the first wave that was between the beginning of March to the beginning of May. And since then, we are now in a second, much more severe wave, a second or a third, whatever you call it, with 800, which seems like a wonderful number to be at. Yesterday, we were at 9,000. But during the first period of COVID-19, we had a very, very strict lockdown in Israel. The lockdown included opening only of pharmacies and food stores, allowing people to go only for 100-meter radius around their homes, but everything else was closed. So that was a very, very strict lockdown that was issued in Israel. And it affected the daily lives of many people around here. Around to the end of May, when the lockdown was about to be released, there was a paper that came out from the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel, showing what was the effect of the lockdown on the population. And this is the report. So I'm just going to highlight few items out of it. Approximately 1/3, 33% of the population has felt stress and anxiety during this time. Almost half of the population reported that their own economic situation and that of their families has worsened as a result of the coronavirus crisis. Half of the population. 27% of the population expect their situation to improve over the next 12 months, 55%, it will not change. They were completely wrong. It is much worse at the moment. But the question, when I saw this report, I wondered, as a neuroscientist, why? Why such a big population in the country felt stress and anxiety? Why this has happened? What are the brain effects? If we have behavioral effects, that must be reflected in the brain as well. So are there any brain effects? And what could we, as people, or the leaders, could have done different in order to avoid this? In Tel Aviv University, we have a neuroimaging center, the Strauss Neuroimaging Center, which is one of the largest activity in neuroimaging in Israel for research. Over 20 groups are working on it. We have state-of-the-art and new MRI scanners, 1,000 healthy volunteers per year, with the main research question about brain plasticity, brain and behavior. So having that database, having that infrastructure under our hands, when the lockdown was released, we came out with the hypothesis following that report. Would increase in anxiety over the population, 1/3 of the population, should be reflected in any brain changes, with the idea that areas in the brain that are more involved in emotional regulation, like the amygdala, should be involved. So the plan that we had was to rescan subjects that were scanned before the lockdown and to explore the regional volumetric brain changes. As a control group, we took brain scans of subjects that volunteered twice before 2020. So we could control for these changes. This is a graph showing the first lockdown period here in March. And then you can see the increase for the second wave period. This is the beginning of May. This is when the lockdown was relieved. And here you can see in red the scans that we have of individual subjects. We had altogether around 70-something subjects that were scanned already. For this report, there are only 50 shown here for the period that was done, that was used for the statistics. And you can see that they were spread here. Now we are in a second lockdown, so we can rescan them again later on, but we were now focused on the scanning that were done during this period. And this is the main results that we have found. So this is the areas in the brain. So the areas that you see in red, in yellow, are areas of which the volume of this area have increased during the lockdown. That was compared per subject for the scan before the lockdown that was done at the end of 2019 to the scan that was done in May or in June. And what we see that there is an increase in the volume of the regions that we know that is part of a complex that is called the medial temporal lobe, which is very central in memory processing, but is also the central hub in the brain for emotional regulation. This is the amygdala. You can see it over here, the amygdala. And also it knows to be primarily affected in stress disorder, anxiety, and post-trauma. The graphic representation, you can see that the vast majority of the subjects that were scanned following the lockdown had increased in the amygdala. And most surprisingly, and interestingly, the effect of the increase in the volume of the amygdala reduced over the days after lockdown. So the first subject that came in the beginning of May had a very huge effect, which reduced for the subject that came later on. which seems that this effect that we have found in the brain seems to be resolved within a few months. Having these results in mind, raise the question on why. Why this lockdown period? And then you can see a video of Tel Aviv in March, where you can see that there is no activity whatsoever. Why this period caused such dramatic brain changes? And I couldn't put any better emoji on that than that. So this is quite an amazing dramatic effect in the brain, which is very, I don't know, very causing some stress just to look at it. It's just terrifying to see this effect. So why this period had such an immense effect on our brain? So we can say it could be because of a new virus that came in, that nobody knows anything about it. Maybe the lockdown itself, the restriction to freedom, maybe the uncertainty about the future, maybe financial concerns that came out of it, maybe it's the social distancing that we are not used to, especially not in the Middle East. And we can always, is it specific to Israel? Because this is the population that we have followed on. I have no answers to this question. So I'm going to give you my opinions on why this has happened. And let's go back to the question that I've asked you before. Would it be different if it had happened in the 80s or the 70s? I think it would have. But why? Is it because of the leadership? Did we have significantly different leadership in the 80s that caused the management of the disease? Did we have the technology have anything to do with it? Is it the air travel that may cause this increase in pandemic? Surely. Today, the situation is different. This is the leadership. This is the technology that replaced all of this. And this is the air travel around the world, which is much, much more significant than what was in the 80s. Surely, air travel will accelerate the spread of the disease. But would it change our reaction to it, or eventually it will become the same, maybe slower if it was in the 80s, but it will be the same situation. So I doubt if air travel should be the cause for the progression of the disease or our reaction to it. As for leadership, so there's a change in leadership, obviously. And to say the least, this is not the shiniest hour of the current world leadership. Just to look at what they've said over the last six months, you can see that they didn't know how to lead the situation. Taking into account this phrase that Trump said a few months ago, the things that happened in Israel when the beginning of the virus, the prime minister stood in prime time and said that the coronavirus can lead to a myriad of dead in Israel. 2 months later, ease your lives, get out, get a coffee, get a beer, and have fun. And currently we are now with the largest daily COVID positive per million worldwide. In Brazil, the Bolsonaro thought that Brazilians would not get anything. He was wrong at the end. In Belarus, tractors will cure everything, drink vodka, whatever, to stop the disease. Or in Mexico, nothing happens if you hug. So this is not the shiniest, this is not the best hour of leadership, but I will say something very unpopular. I'm not sure they are the one to blame directly at what happens to us. Maybe indirectly, we'll get to that in the second, but I don't think they are to blame. So I'm going to bring you now my opinion about it. And I would argue that in the 1980s, the virus would have spread around the world in a very similar manner to what we are experiencing today. In 1980, the world leaders would have been as clueless as the one that we have today, but our behavioral reaction would have been different. I don't think that the amount of stress and anxiety that the population, at least here in Israel, has experienced because of the virus would have been the same if we were in the 1980s. So a new virus without known ontology, scientists are unable to answer basic questions about the virus. We don't have vaccine, we don't have therapy, misinformation, a lot of fake news spreading out in 2020, lack of leadership, all of it is true. But eventually, I want to argue that the lockdown effect on the human brain is a sign on our current, in 2020, inability to cope with long, low intensity, stressful situation, combined with the fake news that we are having and poor leadership and all the rest. But why? Let's dive in theoretically, let's dive in philosophically into this question. So what is the main thing that is different between the 80s and 2020? And I would state that it's technology. Just see that in the 1980s, in order to know what the news are, you had to come in the evening at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock and see the evening news and see what had happened. Today, you have 24 hours TV giving you breaking news of every tiny little detail that happened anywhere in the world, and you are exposed to it in every moment of the day. The news, you use your cellular phone to get news alerts. Every minute something pops out. There is a coronavirus here. There are more people died here. There are more infected people in that neighborhood, in other neighborhoods. So you're always getting this information to your head. In the 1980s, you woke up in the morning, bought a paper, and you could read of what happened yesterday. And also there is the media, the social media, or the opinions that we are getting. If you wanted to get opinions for people or some reports from investigator in the 80s, we would have gone to specialist program like 60 Minutes or whatever. But now everyone can put a tweet or can put something on the social media and can say cold weather will kill the virus or whatever. So you can get this information instantly, and it fuses into our brain. So this is true, but how this is linked to what we have found in other studies. So I want to show you an example of other studies that we have done in the lab in previous years that are related to brain and addiction. In this study, we took mice. So that study was done in mice, not in humans, and triggered them to be addicted, sort of addicted to alcohol, and looked what are the brain change, which areas in the brain have changed. And you can see these areas in red and yellow that have changed. Not going into details what this area do or what they are related to, but you can see a massive change in the brain because they became addicted to alcohol. In another anecdotal study, I took the brain scans of 96 healthy volunteers. All of them were 30 years old at the age of scans, but at the day of the scan, but their birthday was different. So some of them were born in 1967, which means that they were scanned 30 years later. Some of them were born in 1997, which means that they were scanned in 2017, 18. And we did a correlation with the year of birth. And you can see that there are correlations. So the volume of some area in the brain is correlated with the year that we are born. But knowing which regions are dead and comparing the mouse brain into human brain, these are the same areas. The amygdala, hypothalamus, sensory striatum, it doesn't matter the names, but most of these regions are involved in addiction and anxiety together. So I want to state here a speculation, putting these two studies together, a speculation. The technology, so this is a speculation, it's not proven, but it's my hypothesis. The technology causes us to be more susceptible to stress and anxiety by addictive mechanisms. And that should worry us. If this hypothesis is true, and this is something that I want to prove in coming years, if this hypothesis is true, we should be very worried about it. And why? And again, I'm giving you my philosophical opinion on that. Our society is becoming very, very addicted, especially children and youth, with newsfeed, real-time alerts, on-demand content, which most of it is fake, it's unproven, and in some way manipulative. This addiction, as you saw in our studies, interacts with emotional and stress center in the brain, which may cause or may lead to increase in the anxiety and stress levels in the brain from an event that we have very, very little influence on, or will influence us very little eventually. At the end, I want to say that this specific coronavirus period and its brain and behavioral consequences that we have shown are just a showcase to a much broader phenomena, another pandemic, I would call it the technology addiction pandemic, that may have devastating effects on the society and our life, eventually much, much larger than the COVID-19, much, much larger than other effects. And we should be very, very focused on this pandemic, because we now see just an example, what the status of our brain is and how it reacts to this kind of stressful events. The corona is not over yet. It's not over yet, and it's already and we already have shown how the perception of the situation in our brain is affected by technology. But indeed, this is only a taste of what the future would look like. Conditions like that may happen again and again over this year. The global warming, etc., will promote such catastrophes. If we will lead on technology, if our brain will be addicted to technology, to the news alert and whatever, social paranoia, inability to just or trust information of any kind, not only fake one, even real one, virtual life in the social media domain, that will be the future of society. And this is terrifying to say the least. But on the same level, I would say that we, as population, as society, cannot fight the progress. Social networks are indeed the future. The key item here is regulation. Social network and media regulation and awareness to begin with. This is something critical. We must increase the awareness and demand regulations from the government. And although the regulation of social media is not trivial, but it can be done. It can be done. Just imagine that 50, 60 years ago, there was no regulation on smoking, no regulation on cannabis, no regulation on fat consumption and sugars. And these are, in a way, recommendations, but we took them seriously. People are now aware of what smoking is doing, are aware of what high sugar levels may do to our body, are aware of the consequences of taking cannabis on a daily basis, etc. So people are aware of that, and this is very important. I don't think that the people today that know what are the consequences of smoking will take a 12 years old child and give him a cigarette. This is the same way that we should look at social media regulation and awareness. I am specifically, and our team here at Tel Aviv University, going to dedicate our next 5-year research to promote this issue, to promote it through a brain bank. We are building a brain bank. It's already in the process that's scanning more and more healthy subject, and has a long questionnaire about the daily habits and the welfare, etc., and try to create a database of the local population in order to promote question like, but not only, but question like the effect of social network and media. So we are in the process of creating this brain bank, which was the basis for the study that I've shown you on the corona. With this, I want to demonstrate the effects of technology on social media and what it does to our brain. I think to demonstrate it will increase the awareness in the population. I want to use that in order to prove, and this will take time, it is scientific, but I want to prove that social media has some harmful effect on our brain. Once there will be a proof for that, or demonstration and a proof, then we can help to promote the regulation, etc. So I want to promote it through the work that we are doing here in the Storch Neuroimaging Center, creating the data bank. I also want to promote it through a company that I've co-founded, BrainVivo, that provide brain to AI interface, which might provide the means to execute the regulation, etc. But as you know, this kind of research agenda, which is big, costs a lot of money, and I'm building my research on our current fund, internal fund, step by step, brick by brick. But I think that if you want to support it, if somebody wants to support it, any dime would make a difference in promoting such a critical and important agenda as finding what are the origins of brain changes caused by social network and media, and the coronavirus is just an example for that. So this is what I wanted to show you today. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues with whom I've done this work together, Dr. Tom Schoenberg, Ido Tavor, and Tom Salomon. Also to thank the foundation that gave us some funds to do this project. And especially the Storch Neuroimaging Center here in Tel Aviv University that enable us to do this kind of amazing work. And especially I want to thank you for listening to us today, listening to me today about this project. Thank you.
Okay, let's jump into some questions.
Jennifer, for some reason, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe now.
Better?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay, so you talked about our reliance or even dependence on technology and specifically on social media and getting sort of up to the minute updates and, you know, kind of real time, and how that leads to brain addiction and increases our anxiety levels. You talked about the need for regulation, much as we've seen cigarettes regulated or nutritional facts on foods regulated. In terms of the use of social media and technology in general, do you have any, and given how interwoven they are into the fabric of our lives, do you have any practical suggestions?
How to do the regulation? Why? So I think this is a big question. It's not a simple regulation. It's just not, you can't just ban internet or ban having, I don't know, Twitter or whatever. You can't just do it. I think they do a lot of positive things, the social media. But I think the first step is to prove. I think we are in the process of showing that this media has some effect on our brains, and these effects are not at all good, to say the least. Once we show that we can increase awareness. So awareness is something very, very critical, because parents, and I think the people that will be harmed most dramatically by it are children. So first, awareness to parents. Look what your children are doing. Look what they are exposed to. They don't need to look at news every day. They don't need to have media feeds or look at fake news. We have more ability to judge it at first. So awareness is the first thing. Then I think through regulation, I think privacy laws. So companies cannot get into our cellular phone and just put any content that they want. I think that would be the first stage. And I think at the moment, everyone is speaking about privacy, but nothing is done. Then the companies can do whatever they want. So I think these things needs to be discussed very, very deeply, because it's not just because, you know, I don't want people to know what I'm thinking or people to go into my accounts and put things. I think this causes harm. And when something causes harm, then we must stop it, because the effects it will have on society are just terrifying.
Okay, we have a question from one of our listeners about whether you obtained PCR's SARS-CoV-2 tests in your volunteers, and then a follow-up is it possible that there's a direct effect of SARS-CoV-2 to the brain, such as data on amygdala volume?
So first I want to state, and I'm sorry I didn't say it more explicitly, all our subjects were healthy, not infected by COVID-19. They didn't have any symptoms of any kind of any other disease. They were healthy, aside from they had some anxiety, increased anxiety and stress, not related to the virus itself, related to the situation around it. So the effects that we have found are not directly related to the virus. It's just related to the things that happened around the virus, the lockdown, the financial stress or whatever, not the virus itself. We didn't scan subjects that were diagnosed with COVID-19. We didn't scan those. So I can't say on that what would COVID itself would cause to the brain. Obviously, on the brains of subjects that are infected by COVID-19, we will see stress-related effects caused by anxiety, because you're infected by a virus that nobody knows how to treat it. But also the effects of the virus. Some of the people that are affected, there are some incidences in the literature that the loss of smell, the loss of taste might have some neurological relations to it, but those are, I think, on the outwinds of the disease.
Okay, we have so many questions from our listeners, so I'm just going to keep going through those. We have one question about, can you be more specific about the effects on children, sort of maximal ages of vulnerability, the length of exposures, et cetera, to social media?
Right. So again, to say we didn't, our subject were healthy adults, all right? So there were 20, I think the youngest was 24 or something like that. So we didn't scan subjects. So I'm going to give you, again, a philosophical opinion of what I think. The brain of children and youth is much more vulnerable than the adult brain. And it's vulnerable on many domains. First, it's developing. So whatever you put inside will affect their behavior later on. So this is one thing. And the other thing is that they still don't have the judgment and experience that adult has. So if they get, for example, fake news that comes to their WhatsApp or whatever, Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So they get some kind of a feed that is fake. They might not have the judgment to take it very seriously, and that can cause, you know, change of habits. That will give anxiety for itself, because eventually they will be aware that this is wrong news or this is something that was fake. But when a real information will come in, they will not be able to judge if it's real or fake. And that will cause some sorts of, in my experience, in my philosophical understanding, it will lead to some kind of paranoia. We can't trust anyone. We can't trust anything. And because their brain is still developing, they might grow up to be a disturbed adult in that sense. And in a way, you know, you can think I have my cellular phone. Just in case of, this is a very intimate machine. You just go with it and you look at it, and the surrounding is not around you. So anything related to social interaction with friends, with other people, we know that is decreasing in youth, and we need to be very, very aware. Some of it's okay. It's okay to use technology to promote our lives, but we need to understand the limit, and this is something that we don't know at the moment. So the research that we want to do here in Tau, the Brain One, want to answer this question. To what level, we'll call it brain toxicity, has got to a level that we need to stop it.
Okay. In terms of what you're using to collaborate your findings, you're using brain scans. Are you also evaluating attitudes and behavior?
Right. So again, let's separate the brain bank and the study that we have done on the lockdown period. So the lockdown period study, to say the least, was unplanned. All right. So even when we were in lockdown, I didn't think that we are going to scan anyone after we come out from the lockdown, just because of that report. And when I came back to the university for 2 months, I wasn't in my office, wasn't in the university. The scanner didn't do anything. I thought, all right, we need to go back in business, but what? What we are going to do? Can we go back to all the studies that we have done before? Maybe something happened to the brain. And then we scanned, just out of curiosity, we scanned 5 subjects. And when I looked at the result, I said, oh, wow, this is very intense. In all my career, I've never seen such a dramatic effect in the brain. That was too dramatic. So we didn't create a very, very planned study. So we didn't have the time to create, you know, behavioral questionnaires and to take some other tests to see what is the anxiety level, whatever. So we didn't do it very, very thoroughly. So we asked a few questions, but that was very mild. In the brain bank that we are building, we ask a lot of questions about personality, about habits, etc. So we can do these correlations. Correlation of brain of behavior is a very difficult task in our imaging. But in the brain bank, we do want to do that. We do want to have a mark that will show on the population here if your daily usage of social media is like 2 hours, that will affect your brain in that way. To do that, we need a lot of subjects that will be scanned. 10,000, 20,000. This is the number that we are aiming at.
And this will allow you to make some sort of recommendations based on your research findings.
Eventually. I think it will be premature to say something now and maybe a bit irresponsible. But eventually, once this database will be big enough, once we will have the statistical method to give a recommendation, yes. And specifically here in Tel Aviv, dissemination to the public of our results is very, very important. even in the very stages of this brain bank, I want to create a website that people can interact with. Although they won't be able to see their own results, all right, because that would be a personal recommendation, which we are not at the stage of giving. They could see the group level analysis and see what it does. I think that in the future, again, philosophical opinion, I think that in the future, in 5 years, the way that we have now companies that do genetic testing, 23andMe, MyHeritage, etc., that we will have to the brain, and people can log in, put their brain scan, and get a report at that. So it will take time, and it's a vision, but I think having a brain bank is the way to get it.
That's the step forward.
Right.
Another question from a listener. Are you familiar with the work of Carol Dweck and her work on mindset?
No, I can't say that I do.
Okay.
But if somebody will send me the link, that I will read it.
Question about mindset affecting attitude and resiliency, but we'll have to table that till we get the link and can bring you up to speed on her work, I think.
Definitely.
What are I want to go back to your discussions about social media, and especially on our youth. The children who are in school now, they're going to be our future leaders, and they're growing up just in a life that's built on technology. And especially since we've been in the throes of the pandemic, many parents have lamented that they worked so hard to get their children off technology, and now they're being forced onto technology. So given that we have this generation that's growing up so technology resilient, what do you think are going to be the effects on their brains? What does it mean for the future? Sort of, if you had a crystal ball and you're looking into the future, how do things look to you?
Well, to say first, I'm not against technology for children. So we actually have done a study, I think 8 years ago, that show how computer games, a car racing game, increases the connectivity of spatial navigation skills in your brain. So it can do good in a sense. The interaction with computers or screen time or whatever. I think that specifically the work with social media, with Facebook or with WhatsApp, and the interaction there are a bit problematic to the developing brain, in my view. So again, I give you my suspicions because I didn't do a study about it, and I didn't see any good neuroimaging study working on that population. I would say, so there is a phrase, a quantity that is more acceptable in the jargon of neuroimagers, which is brain toxicity. And brain toxicity is changes that are not to the level that you have a tumor or whatever. So changes in the brain that may promote, I wouldn't say abnormal, but negative behavior, that may promote negative behavior, like increase in anxiety. So it changes in the medial temporal lobe that may happen. We see that it happened to adults. I am sure that the effects that we have seen in adults happen to children. I'm sure in Israel. This medial temporal lobe is a hub of all the emotional processing that we have, and a lot of anxiety and stress related disorders are concentrated in this area. So stress disorder is one of them, but you can name a few. All of them has different mechanism and different interaction with the brain. But post-traumatic stress disorder, I don't know, obsessive compulsive behavior, all the schizophrenia in a way. In a way, I'm not saying that this promotes schizophrenia. We don't know, but this is the area that is associated with. We don't want to mess with it. We don't want to mess with it, especially not at the time that our brain is developing. And I think we should be, I don't want to cause an alarm, but I think we should be very, very concerned and put our energy and effort as we are doing in Tel Aviv. So I think this is the agenda that we should promote in neuroimaging. And this is what we are going. So we need to put our time, put our heads, put our funds into that in order to come up with answers. I think that question deserves a very, very direct answer. That amount of hours per day for a child will cause that amount of brain toxicity. And people should know that, like taking 10 cigarettes a day will cause that kind of nicotine addiction. So we need to know the numbers, and to know the numbers is through research. And in brain imaging, we have a lot of information about diseased people, not enough on healthy people. We need to scan more and more healthy population in order to get this brain bank and to say something meaningful about it.
That makes sense. You talked about neuroimaging. From a neuroimaging perspective, is there a difference between acute short-term stress and chronic long-term stress? And if so, are the changes that you're seeing in current subjects consistent with short-term or long-term stresses?
Right. So let's go to answer this. I want to give a short review of people that are working. So again, stress and trauma are not my expertise. I've never worked on this before this study. But it was around me. So I heard a lot of studies around it. Most of the research done on trauma and stress is related to significant, very intense event, short-term, very, very stressful, like war or a terror attack or whatever. And then you see the effect. Most of the people recover from it. It's very intense, and then the relief is very intense as well. So it takes a bit of time, but then they are relieved. It is assumed that 5 to 10% of the population of people that will undergo an intense, acute, short-term stress or traumatic event will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very, very significant dramatic disorders. There is very, very little in the literature about low intensity, but very, very long stressful events. I'm not sure that was even studied in any way. I don't know how it can be studied. I think we had a very, very, very real life opportunity to have a first glance into that kind of defect. What this will lead on, I would say that I just hope that the brain reaction would not be just as high intensity short event. Because if that would be, and 5% of the population will develop PTSD, at least in Israel, it will be catastrophic, to say the least. Will have devastating catastrophic effects on the society. So I hope not, and I don't have the answer to, but we will continue. Actually, after this second lockdown, which seems to be even more ridiculous than the first one, we will try to rescan this subject again and see what's happening. The PTSD pattern in the brain is different from what I've shown you. What I've shown you is stress, seems to be similar to stress and anxiety. What we know, PTSD has different patterns, and I do hope we won't see that. I just hope that won't happen.
So speaking about exposure to stress, we've seen our experience with Holocaust survivors and others who've experienced trauma to that degree. Some people are able to handle prolonged periods of stress much better than others. Is there anything we can draw, any sort of conclusions in terms of being forward-thinking about how we can strengthen our communities?
So I think this is where we need to converge several studies in the field of biology. So we have done a study here on heredity. Heredity, so people that survived the Holocaust, some epidemiologic studies have shown that their grandchildren do suffer from, some high risk of mental disorders or high risk of heart conditions, etc. And that was shown also in other stress events like the starvation that was in the Netherlands after the First World War, etc. That caused the grandchildren to have some disorders. So, and these are epidemiological studies. You can't say much about it. But what we have done here, so we tried to recreate this effect by working on mice. So we took mice that took mice that didn't eat healthy food, And we looked at and we did imaging to the second generations of these mice. And we do found that the second generations, the brain of the second generation has some patterns of eating disorders. The brain looks like in a pattern of eating disorders. And when we checked for the blood glucose level, we saw that they are pre-diabetic. Although they were healthy, they were healthy nutrition like the control mice. That means that people that had exposed to very, very stressful events like the Holocaust or starvation or this period, not that I'm comparing, or this period of the corona, not to compare anything, this will affect generations ahead because some of the molecules that we have in our body, some that are called RNA, or some kind of RNA, goes into the sperm, goes into the egg, and then just passes. So anxiety-related mRNA or whatever just passes through the generation. And I think the consequences might be larger than the lives of our children, but might go to the lives of their children. And although maybe what I'm saying is terrifying and catastrophic in a way, I'm just giving you a philosophical opinion that we have some indication that might happen. We must explore it further in order to know what is the context of that, how catastrophic the situation is. If we know that, I'm sure we will be able to find ways in order to cope with it. First, on the social level, how we interact with other number, the pace of life, things like that, the responsibility of ourselves to the welfare of the children and their offspring, etc. But also biologically with drugs or to put more efforts in developing that agenda in the pharmaceutical industries.
You raise a really interesting issue. So we have this current pandemic with the coronavirus. Is this different from other pandemics such as SARS or swine flu or avian flu? Does this look categorically different to you?
Well, I think that those happened. They were not so long ago. I think the SARS or the MERS were 15 or several years ago. And you can see the differences, even for the swine flu. So we had 2 years ago, something that seems to be a very severe swine flu in Israel. And that caused panic. They just wanted to get a vaccine and didn't have enough vaccines and people didn't know what to do. It was panicking around the situation. Then a month later, they saw that there was no more casualties than in any regular winter and it was like a big whoop and just let it go. But the reaction to this swine flu 2 years ago, again, was the first sign of what's happening now in the coronavirus, didn't happen when SARS was, when MERS was, didn't happen in flu pandemic 20 years ago. And I think it's all that we get the information fused in our brain, the news are fused in our brain and just increase our anxiety and panic inside our brain. So I think, yes, it's different than what it was before.
Different, or maybe just different because of our constant exposure to it, perhaps.
It's different, yeah.
We have a number of questions about the brain and COVID. So one of them is around any hypotheses you might have about coincidences that the brain areas you highlight are similar to those implicated for some in neuro-COVID after effects?
No. So the ones that are infected by COVID, the minority of them, it's really a small number, has neurological signs that are in the basal brain, in the basal area of the brain where the olfactory trajectories are fusing into the brain. Just because it seems to affect major the sense of smelling and taste, and this is where the nerve fuses in the brain, and that can cause, it seems on the very few cases, may cause some kind of edema or infection like seems to be like edema in the brain, but this region was not affected in our study. So these are completely different aspects.
What about, have you noticed abnormality in any of the visual areas of the brain?
Yeah, so what we've done, so statistics is a major issue in neuroimaging. So when you look without controlling for, there are many things statistics we have to control to be certain that our observation is a true one, all right? Because there could be many mistakes. So the results that we have shown in the medial temporal lobe passed all the statistical corrections that we had to do. We did have effect in some, I don't know, low-level visual areas, but those didn't went through all the statistical correction. It could be that with the larger cohort, we could have seen that, but it was not very strong effect in the cohort that we have studied.
Okay. Some questions about the impact of the lockdown on the brain. Not seeing friends, not seeing family, not being in an interactive workplace. And then for Israelis who are currently on more formal lockdown, not being able to go out to the beach in nature, being on Zoom all day, sort of impacts on the brains due to all that.
Well, let's say one thing about the second lockdown that we are, it's very strict, but nobody listened to it. So, so there is somewhat loss of trust in the government. And if you go to the beach in Israel, you will see a lot of people currently. But the question is the different effects that the lockdown may lead to. So in the behavioral analysis that we have done to the very, very naive questionnaire that we gave the subject, we could separate it into 2 dimensions. So there were some people that were more stressed, had higher anxiety, but in terms of social distancing, so interaction with other people, we didn't show any problem. There were others that showed that they had a very strong social distancing with us, but they weren't stressed about financial or anxious about other stuff. So I think these are 2 parallel issues. So social distancing and wearing the mask can cause some problems in interaction between people, to say the least. And as humans, we do need the social interaction. We do need the occasional, well, especially in Israel, you do need the occasional hug. You do need the occasional, whatever. So that would have an effect. Eventually, it might be related. It might be the outcome of it might be stress as well, but first it will be a change in behavior. So we need to change our behavior in social distancing, something that we were used to do, like going to our parents, giving them a hug, going to our friends, giving a handshake. We don't do that anymore. So this is a behavioral change and it has its own consequences. The anxiety from financial issues, or from the virus itself. I think from the first days of the spread of the virus in Israel, we didn't know if the sun is going to shine tomorrow. Right? It was that dramatic. So that caused anxiety for itself. So these are 2 parallel conditions that will have different effects on the brain. We couldn't find on the small cohort, so 50, 67 subjects that we have scanned, we couldn't find on the small cohort to separate that area is related to stress solely, and that area is related to behavioral change in social. We couldn't separate it. I would say that, to my opinion, it is. If we had a bigger cohort, 200 subjects, 250 subjects, we would be able to separate it. And the better questionnaire about the behavior, we would be able to separate it. And again, these kind of questions, the brain bank will be able to answer them. What is the effects of social interaction and stress on the population?
There are some reports that are claiming people who have recovered from COVID-19 feel they've lost mental capacity, they're foggy. Have you looked into any of that?
Yeah, so we didn't scan any people that were infected by COVID-19. So I don't, maybe we will, maybe it's high time to do that. But what I would want to say about this virus, we don't know. Okay, this is a very, very tricky virus, and we need to accept that and acknowledge that. We don't know, and it's I don't know, it's very I wouldn't say a shame, but it's very frustrating as a scientist that I look at the scientific community and we couldn't say anything meaningful about this virus over the last 6 months. It's very frustrating, to say the least, but we don't know. So they might have the recovery period of the virus. You know, after you have a flu and the symptoms are gone, it takes another 2 to 3 weeks to recover from the fatigue or for the muscle aches that you have from the flu. From the corona, so, and we know that, and we are aware of that, and we are okay with it. From the corona, we don't know. And I think it will take time. It will just take time until we know all the medical and health-related consequences of that. And maybe also to scan, you know, people that were recovered from COVID-19 or from the virus and see what is the traces in their brain and how fatigue is reflected in the brain. It may be linked to other factors like as depression or whatever.
So one sort of question about how to handle this stress on the brain, you know, some of our listeners are asking, can you do activities like yoga or any sort of practice of mindfulness to sort of bring down the temperature and hopefully de-stress the brain? Is anything like that shown to be effective?
So I can give you my own experience. So when the lockdown was released in Israel, I think I can testify that I was stressed as anyone else from the situation. But in that time, you know, the general security services in Israel started to follow on our cellular phone to see if we are in close proximity to corona infected people. And then I thought, why should I go with my cellular phone anywhere so people can track me? All right? Why should I go there? Not because I want to know if I was near a corona affected person, but just I didn't want, you know, the government to follow on me. I thought that this is wrong. You
wanted to be off the grid.
Right. So from time to time, I left my cellular phone at home, and I can tell you, I think for 15 years, I've never felt that free and able to do whatever I want without, you know, things coming up, you know, questions, WhatsApp, newsfeed, etc. So it's okay to put the cellular phone, the internet, Facebook, whatever, to put it down for a few hours a day. It's okay. That will affect dramatically, but we need to be very persistent. It's very, you know, whenever I close it down, I say, if I had the phone, I could see somebody could have sent me a message. I need to see if I got an email. I need to see that. No, we need to remove this addiction in a way, at least for a few hours a day. I think that would make a difference. Any sport activity, when you do sport activity, you are not looking at your phone, usually. And any sports activity, especially if it's with someone, it's not very individual, it's with somebody. You do yoga with someone, you run outside with someone, you cycle with someone. I do martial arts, so I have to do it with someone else. All right? So you need to do this kind of activity. Any of those relaxes and reduces stress. This is a fact. So do it as much as you can.
Well, thank you for that. You actually took my last question, which was going to be recommendations for how to keep our brains healthy. Those sound like great practical, you know, controlling, taking time out where we're not exposed to the up to the second updates on our phones and getting, you know, being physical and physical activity. And that certainly sounds like practical things we can all look to implement in our daily lives. Unfortunately, we got to a fraction of our questions. There was so much interest in your work, Professor Assaf. Thank you for being so generous with your time and for sharing your insights today. They were clearly sparked so much interest on the part of our viewers. To all of you around the world, thank you for joining us today. We are proud to be able to bring you cutting-edge work being done at Tel Aviv University directly with these webinars. We hope they're providing you with knowledge about current events and happenings and the work being done, as well as pride at what Tel Aviv University and Israel are contributing to the larger world. As usual, we will be sending a link to today's presentation to all of our listeners, and you can also find this webinar and all the others on our AFTAU website in our webinar library. Please feel free to check out the more than 30 webinars and free online classes that are found there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and wishing you a Chag Sameach and a wonderful Sukkot.
Chag Sameach, and thank you, everybody.